factory farming is an awful thing. Everybody believes that. And yet, farming, when animals are involved, seems like a pretty awful thing too. So, what are we supposed to work toward? No farming at all? No factory farming? Some kind of combination? Some kind of evolution? We're going to talk with somebody today who has a lot to say about that. So, do stay with us. Hi, everybody. I am Victoria Moran, and you are listening to the Main Street Vegan Podcast, bringing you vitality, spirituality, and compassion since 2012. And it is an honor today to welcome back someone who was on the program a long time ago. I'm thinking 2010-ish, something
Yeah.
like that. He can tell us. And that was when he was on in the capacity of cookbook author, co-author with his lovely wife. They've actually written two fabulous cookbooks, but today we'll be talking with Dan Shannon by himself in his capacity as CEO of the Humane League. Now, Dan is a seasoned nonprofit strategist with over 2 decades of experience in campaigns, philanthropy, and animal protection, including leadership roles at PETA, Purpose, and the Tides. And through his writing and through his being, he is changing the world for animals. Welcome, Dan.
Thank you, Victoria. It's very nice to be back, and it's very nice to talk to you today.
Wonderful to talk with you. So I know you are just back in the States after a wonderful visit to the UK. Now, I know that was a pleasure trip, but did you happen to pick up anything going on over there in the animal rights world? I always think of them as being so ahead of us.
Yeah, I think of them the same way. I think on a couple of levels. So on just on a personal level, being there with my family for 2 weeks, I was just blown away by the um, availability of vegan food. Just everywhere we went, every little pub that we stopped in or coffee shop, right, there'd be a vegan something, there'd be a vegan baked good or a vegan treat or a vegan burger. You know what I mean? Just there was an option. And even living in New York City as I do, it's like we don't have quite that level of penetration yet. So that really struck me in terms of how far I think that country and that culture is on their kind of vegan journey. And I think the mainstream sort of acceptance of vegan as just a very normal lifestyle that a lot of people lead and and needs to be accommodated by businesses. Um, but then more on the kind of professional side and the sort of movement side, as you may know, like as you said, the UK is much farther ahead on making kind of systemic reforms to some of the worst abuses of animals in the factory farming industry, the UK and then Europe as well, to a point where we think it's very possible that even at some point later this year, if not next year, there's a meaningful possibility of passing federal farm to animal welfare legislation in the United Kingdom that would eliminate the use of extreme confinement measures like battery cages for egg laying hens. It's not a guarantee. There's still a lot of work left to do, and our comrades at the Humane League UK are working very hard on that project right now to try to ensure that law passes. But just comparing that to our sort of political and public policy landscape in the United States, it's sort of frankly unthinkable to imagine that at least at this moment in time, right, that something like federal farm to animal welfare legislation could be passed in the United States. I do think we need to get there, and we will, but it's not going to be today or tomorrow. So
Yeah.
to your point, I think there are places where the movement is just quite a bit further along than we are here in the
Yeah.
States.
So before we go on, I just for anybody who's saying, I think I know him, I think I heard him before. So you were on with your wife Maggie, correct?
Annie.
Annie and Dan, and that book that you were on with, I know you wrote two. Tell us both.
Yeah, that's right. So I think we were on with you to discuss the first book we wrote, which was called Betty Goes Vegan.
Oh, that's
Which,
right.
yeah,
Yeah,
it
doing
was.
all the Betty Crocker recipes vegan. Such a
That's
great
right.
idea.
Yeah, we when I say we, my wife is I think the real kind of food talent in the family. But we cooked our way through, as you said, the sort of classic Betty Crocker cookbook, right? including all of the, which, as you know, like has a long history and goes back quite a ways,
Yeah.
including all of the very, I would say, sort of retrograde or kind of outdated recipes from like the 1950s that, vegan or not, nobody would eat anymore in today's day and age. So a lot of the recipes obviously were great, right? And
Yeah.
there was a lot of great food in the cookbook, and some of them were a little bit more of a kind of arts and crafts project than
Yeah.
anything else. How do you recreate these sort of, I don't know, Jello mold type of recipes that wouldn't be the kind of thing that any contemporary person would probably be making in their kitchen?
Yeah, I remember even as a new, well, vegetarian trying to be vegan in the early 70s, it was like, but how do you do Jello? We were
Right.
all working with agar,
Yep.
like anybody cared. And then there was, how do you make a tuna casserole with a potato chip crust without the tuna and maybe something better than potato chips? See, all the struggles we don't have anymore, although we do have some new ones. So you are now with the Humane League. Tell us the raison d'etre for the Humane League. What are you guys doing that is your specialty?
Absolutely. So the Humane League, our mission is to end the abuse of animals raised for food. And for me, that means ending factory farming as a practice. We can talk more about, what that means. But our primary way that we at the Humane League go about trying to bring about the end of factory farming is by working with companies and with government. So sort of institutional power holders to reform and eliminate the worst abuses of animals on factory farms. So many of our campaigns right now are focused on getting companies to go 100% cage free in their egg supply chain. So only purchase eggs from cage free or better suppliers. I'm sure your listeners are very well familiar with the cruelty that goes on in the egg industry and in battery cages, but we're talking about cages the size of a file cabinet drawer that 4 to 6 laying hens are going to live their entire miserable lives in. And moving from that to cage-free environments where animals have a little bit more room to move, who can move around, can express more of their natural behaviors. We should be very clear with one another that even those animals are not living a life that you or I would want to live or would want our cat or dog to live, right? So we would need to be very clear-eyed that even eliminating the worst abuses of factory farming still leaves a lot of abuses left on the table. But we see this as our entry point because that's sort of what we feel like is feasible and possible right now, right? We can and have made significant progress in weeding out these worst abuses, like with cage free. When I started doing this work 25 years ago, cage free was sort of less than a percentage point of the U.S. egg laying industry, and now almost 50% of the U.S. egg industry has moved to cage-free or better welfare standards. That's significantly reduced the suffering of many, many, many millions of animals, which is a meaningful improvement, even if, again, we wouldn't want to live the lives that animals live, even in cage-free systems. And we're focused on that because we think that that's where power lies, right? For better or for worse, right? In the society that we live in, power
Mhm.
lies with companies and corporations, and it lies with governments, right? I think we talked about when I was on previously, I've been a vegan for almost 30 years at this point, and you've got, it sounds like some time on me. Um, but in my life, I may have impacted the lives of, maybe thousands of animals with my personal dietary choices. Whereas when companies make a decision, right, to shift their supply chains to higher welfare standards, they can make decisions that affect millions of animals at a time. So our philosophy is to go where the power is and where the ability is to make decisions that impact animals at significant scale.
So before we get into the specifics about what you're doing and what the Humane League is doing, because most of the audience are vegans, and there seems to always be this debate
Yeah,
between the pragmatic and the aspirational. And I think that all of us who are committed to being vegans in our personal lives want this to be a vegan world. We
yeah,
want it to be a vegan
absolutely.
world yesterday. And some people are so convinced that that's the only way, that's just straight through there. Anything other than that is actually harming animals.
That's right.
And yet you're talking about this other side of things. And I think too, there's this, anybody can say cage free who feels like it. So how can people who aren't yet vegan really feel that they're doing less harm than they might otherwise.
Yeah, as you said, I think it's an important conversation to have. So my philosophy is that I think we need multiple strategies to bring about the end of factory farming and the end of abuse of animals. Some of those strategies absolutely need to be, what you might think of as abolitionist or, sort of strategies which are about getting people to eliminate animal products for their diet. That work absolutely needs to happen. There are many great groups and individuals in the animal protection ecosystem that are doing that work, and we think that that work is great. I don't believe that if that's all that we do, we're going to get to where we need to be. Because I think uh, in the meantime, right, I think about it two different ways. In the meantime, imagine whatever timeline you think it's going to take to get to a vegan world. I don't think it's going to be in my lifetime. I don't think it's going to be in my daughter's lifetime. That's my perspective. Um, in the meantime, as we know, billions of animals, tens of billions of animals are suffering on factory farms as we're having this conversation right now. And I believe we have a moral obligation, right, to take their suffering into consideration and take concrete steps to eliminate their suffering while, right, we continue to make progress towards that end state that we all want, which is a world free of animal exploitation.
So let me ask you a pragmatic question from the aspirational point of view. How can we possibly meet the need for animal foods without factory farming?
Yeah, I don't think we can, right? Which is exactly why I think that needs to be our end goal, which is sort of eliminating the factory farming. I do feel like, I mean, again, this is all thinking into the future, and I don't pretend to be an expert on all these things, but I feel like the solution, right, the way we get to an end of at least the current scale, and sort of depth of suffering that animals are experiencing in the food system is part of it is significantly reducing people's consumption of animal products. That has to be a huge part of it. To your point, there's just no way, right, to kind of meet the current scale of demand without intensive confinement systems. It can't be done. Again, that's not the lane that we are in at the Humane League, but that is an important lane, and people need to be doing that work. Um, and then I think finding alternate ways, right, to meet demand for things that at least look and feel like animal products, right? Which I do think is always going to exist. I think there's a range of strategies for doing that. Cultivated meat is one strategy. Plant-based meat analogs is another strategy. But finding other ways to meet the demand that remains. And then I think the third piece is finding if there is always going to be some amount of animal agriculture that takes place. I hope that that's not the case, to be clear, that the world I want to live in is one where there is no animal agriculture, but finding ways to, conduct animal agriculture that are significantly less harmful or eliminate not just the worst abuses, but most abuse. And I just want to be crystal clear cage free is not that. Cage free is not. It eliminates significant abuse to animals, but it does not it does not eliminate it all. It is still a form of factory farming.
So, as factory farming becomes less and less common, I would assume that these foods will get more and more expensive.
That's also my assumption. I think there's a real question about how quickly and how cost effectively things like lab grown meat or sort of plant based meat analogs can become so that they could be cost competitive to meat. My understanding is that we're still quite a ways away from that, but my also understanding is also that it is like technologically and economically possible, that it is a solvable problem. But how quickly it will be solved is outside of my area of expertise.
Mhm. In my experience, I know a lot of vegans. I hang
Me,
out with a lot of vegans, but my friends and colleagues who are not yet vegan all believe that they are eating humane meat. I
yeah,
get all my meat, from small farms. But when really pressed, of course, oh, so this means you never go out. Well, yeah, I go out. And so, and then we also know that the small farms have problems of their own, and nothing is perfect in terms of the animals. So, just walk me through the future scenario. Is this going to happen so slowly that societies adapt around it? I mean, or are there going to be riots in the street because of the price of eggs? We saw something
Yeah.
similar to that a couple of years ago.
Yeah, I don't know if it's a pessimistic assessment, but my sort of conservative, my small c conservative assessment is that I do think this is going to be a generations long transition. I think it is, and so to your point, I think the transition will likely happen slowly and incrementally, right? And I don't know that there will be sort of what you might think of as sort of like cataclysmic kind of shocks or step changes that would lead to, the kind of significant pushback that you described. I mean, this is how I see the path, just from my own vantage point. I believe very much that we are making significant progress at both at eliminating the worst abuses of factory farming. I mentioned how the progress that's been made in the egg industry around cage free. I mentioned where countries like the UK and the rest of Europe are significantly further ahead than either we are in the US. And I think what we see as industries move as a result of changes in consumer demand, right, for higher welfare products and also public pressure from groups like the Humane League, is that what then happens is that political opposition to reform starts to evaporate. I mentioned the situation that the UK is in right now. I mentioned so the US is 50% cage free in the egg industry. The UK is at about 85% cage free. So the overwhelming majority of the UK egg industry is already cage free. And now what we see in the UK is that the industry itself is actually advocating for the government to eliminate the use of cages federally through a piece of legislation. And so I think this is a little bit of sort of like how these things work in cycles, right? Where if we can move the industry through public pressure and consumer demand off of some of the worst abuses, right? We can then create the political space for policies to be passed to kind of lock that progress in, right? And then we have to begin the project again, right? Okay, well, what's next after cage free? Do we then talk about moving industries from cage free to pasture raised, right? To again raise the level of welfare standard, first starting with the industry and then starting with government regulation, right? And this is where I think we're going to need to go through multiple iterations of that cycle, right? Before we get to a point where it is no longer legal to treat animals in the way that we would currently think of as factory farming. Again, and I think it's a long ways off. I think in parallel to that needs to be what we talked about earlier, which is the change in consumer demand, right? There also needs to be advocacy. And again, not what we do at the Humane League, but a lot of great groups that are doing this work to help people better understand the implications of the dietary choices that they make, the health implications, the environmental implications, of course, the animal welfare implications. And doing the kind of diet and culture change work to significantly reduce demand so that as welfare standards improve and as demand shrinks, right, there can be a kind of meeting, right, of, okay, now it is going to be possible to meet the demand that does exist with these higher welfare systems, especially if a significant amount of that demand is being met through things like cultivated meat or meat analogs. I
Yeah.
think that's going to take a very long time, right? And I think multiple strategies are going to be required to get there, but that's sort of the path as I see it. And what I take comfort in is that, and I'm sure and your listeners may be familiar with this, but when you look at public polling, right, and sort of when questions are put, at least to the public about what they think our food system ought to look like, most people, overwhelming majority of people, don't think it should look like factory farming, right? I saw a poll that suggested 85% of Americans believe that farmed animals should not be made to suffer to produce food. Now, obviously, there's a huge disconnect between that polling response and then what people are actually doing when they go to the grocery store. So I'm not naive to think that that means everybody's just ready to go vegan tomorrow. But my point is that I do feel like the industry is able to get away with a lot of this stuff because people are genuinely not aware, right? And I do feel like most people who have some kind of sense of the world, who vote and read the newspaper, and you know what I mean, are kind of engaged citizens, which isn't everybody, unfortunately, have a sense that there's probably something bad happening to animals on factory farms. I do think that general awareness exists. And so I feel like, and this is our core strategy at the Humane League, the more we can help people understand that that's a tractable problem. We can actually do something about it. Like, yes, it is bad. It's actually probably quite a bit worse than you think it is, but there is something that can be done about it, right? There are steps that can be taken today. And even for folks who aren't ready to necessarily go vegetarian or vegan in the way that we have been and your listeners have been, but we have to acknowledge that everybody's just not ready for that yet, right? If we can create opportunities for them to participate in the project of ending factory farming, do you know what I mean? I think we can then bring people on their own journey, right? And that's a lot of how I think about our campaigns at the Humane League. Many of the people, the majority of our supporters at the Humane League, are not vegetarian or vegan.
Hmm.
They are people who care about farmed animal welfare but haven't yet made that choice, right? Um, and I believe that the more those people participate with us, the more they see our campaigns, the more they learn about the reality of factory farming. They see the video footage, the images that we've all seen. They're going to get there over time, or at least a lot of them will. And so I also think about in the same way that industries need to go on a journey, like individuals need to go on a journey, right? I am somebody who went, quote unquote, cold turkey. I learned about it for the first time. Somebody put a leaflet in my hand. It blew my mind, and I never ate meat again. That was my journey. That's not most people's journey, right? For most people's journey, they maybe give it a try. They take a step back. It kind of goes in waves. It isn't a linear progression. And I just think we have to hold space for that as a movement. If people are ready to go vegan tomorrow, that's awesome, right? And there's plenty of resources and tools for them, but that's not most people. And I think if we don't have anything to say to those people as a movement about how they can be a part of what we're trying to do, I think we'd be making a mistake.
Well, the classic argument is always, but if there's no factory farming, where's your argument to the people that don't really get it at a heart level, the whole ahimsa, non-violence, non-killing thing? If the animals are perfectly fine and have one bad day, as they always say, then what's the motivation ever to go vegan?
Yeah. Yeah. My argument to that person would be that world is not going to exist in your lifetime. And so to your point, it's a nice fantasy. That sounds awesome. I would love to live in that world, and I just don't think that I will. And I don't know that anybody who's alive today will. And this argument doesn't work with everybody, obviously, but I encourage people to just set that idea aside and really focus on this is the reality of factory farming today. These are the choices that you have to make, in living in the world as it exists,
Hmm.
and that your choices are pretty clear. And
Yeah.
that idea of, well, I'm just going to eat animals, eat products from animals who lived a happy life and just had one bad day, that's not a choice. That choice does not exist to you at the moment, right?
And
And I think we have to encourage people to really live in the reality as it exists today.
This is interesting that it's not just animal rights and farm animals. It's a lot of social issues. I'm thinking about homelessness, and we want to
Yeah.
get rid of homelessness. We want these people to have homes, but the guy on the corner today with the paper cup needs to eat.
Yeah,
And it's kind
100%.
of the same sort of thing that we've got to be working on both ends of it. So you mentioned something earlier that I just want to cycle back to in terms of eggs. I
Mm,
think that everybody thinks about eggs in cartons. And
mm.
so vegans would say, I don't eat those at all. Other people would say, I get mine cage free, or I don't care, or whatever they say. But beyond the eggs in cartons, there are the eggs used in everything else.
Everything.
And I
Yeah.
think most people, even vegans, are unaware that the laws for the eggs in cartons are actually better for the chickens, much better than the laws for all those millions of eggs that go into packaged foods. Can you kind of suss that out for us?
Yeah, for sure. I agree that this is an important point for people to be very clear about. As I think I mentioned, a big part of most of what we do at the Humane League is we work with, companies on welfare standards in their supply chain. Our ask to companies is always to elevate the welfare standard in their supply chain across both what they call shell eggs, right, or ingredient eggs, right? Because many of the companies that we've gotten to move, um, eggs in as an ingredient is what they're primarily purchasing, right? About 50% of eggs in the U.S. are sold in grocery stores, so fully half of the eggs that people eat are they're eating as an ingredient, right? Whether it's at a restaurant, as part of a baked good, whatever it happens to be. So our perspective at the Humane League is that welfare, a chicken is a chicken, and they don't know what kind of egg they're laying and how somebody's they're going to buy it in a carton or a omelet or a cookie, and they don't care, right? So welfare standards need to be the same for animals across the board. Whatever is going to be done with the eggs that they've laid. And when we do public policy work, right, and when we try to advance, again, federal public policy for farm animals on extreme confinement is not really in the cards at the moment. But as your listeners probably know, many states, I think about 12 states, have passed pretty meaningful state level laws restricting or even eliminating the use of extreme confinement for egg laying hens, for gestation crates for pregnant pigs, veal calves, etc. Um, and we always advocate for those laws to be across the board, right? Again, the chickens and the pigs don't know what ingredients they're being used for. It doesn't matter to them. The focus has to be on the animals.
So, do you work only with companies or do you also work with farmers at all? I think people are always interested in what it's like to be a farmer today, because it does seem like there's a very difficult way to make a living. It's not, my grandparents had a little farm and it was very different. It wasn't big, it wasn't
Yeah,
terribly prosperous, but it was theirs.
yeah,
And nowadays, most farmers are working for some big company, and that whole thing of, passing down the family farm and having this pride and ownership, it's just gone.
yes, 100%. I couldn't agree more. One of the things I think most American consumers, and honestly, even people who are relatively well educated and maybe are vegetarian or vegan, really have no idea how much the farming industry has changed over really the past like 75 years, right? Which is like a pretty, like if you think about humans have been doing agriculture for like 11,000 years, and we've really only been doing factory farming for about 75 of those years in the way that we think about it today.
Mhm.
Based on extreme confinement, primarily indoor housing, et cetera, the things that I think define factory farming. So to your point, a lot of people have a version of the story that you shared, like, oh, my grandparents had a like your grandparent, maybe not your but people's grandparents or their great grandparents and their farms that existed in a fundamentally different era of what the farming industry looked like, and it may very well have been that that was significantly better than what animals are experiencing on factory farms right now, but that is not the reality that exists today in 2026 for the overwhelming 97% of animals in this country that are raised or higher than that in factory farming conditions. So I think what we find, to your point, is it's overwhelmingly a corporatized and consolidated industry right now. There's a small number of big agribusiness companies that have tremendous influence over the industry, and like any other, sort of highly sort of conglomerated industry, they're always looking to cut costs, always looking to maximize profits, and that comes at the expense of the animals. It comes at the expense of the farmers and the workers themselves. To your point, when we do talk to farmers, we hear, particularly people who have been doing it maybe for multiple generations, we hear how much worse it has gotten just for them as humans involved in the system, let alone for the animals or for the planet. And so I do feel like part of our work that we have to do, to sort of bring about the vision that we talked about earlier, is to educate people, not just on the specifics of the ways that animals suffer, but also just like on the way the industry works, because I really do feel like one of the barriers, and I think you spoke to this a little earlier, Victoria. I think one of the barriers that some people have in their head is this idea that like animals suffering for food is just the way that it's an intractable problem. There's nothing we could do about it. It's not really solvable, so I'm not even going to bother to try. You know, um, and I really think it's helpful to try to help those people understand that factory farming is a relatively new invention, right? It's been invention in like the lifetimes of a lot of people that are alive today, and it can be uninvented. We can move past it. Again, we've been doing animal agriculture for 11,000 years. We've been doing factory farming for 75. I really do believe that a point in time will come where this will feel like a blip on the radar. And even if that takes another 100 years, that's still a fraction of, what I mean, the history that we're talking about. And so I think helping people understand that this is a new phenomenon, right? It's been constructed intentionally by corporate interests to serve their needs, and we can unconstruct it, right? In the same way that other industry transformations have taken place. We're seeing it less in the US, unfortunately, but like, as your listeners may know, like right now, there's a clean energy revolution taking place in China. And I think I saw a stat the other day, like 50% of China's energy is coming from renewable energy right now. And that's happened over the past like 20 years. That's a massive change in a huge industry happening pretty quickly. You know what I mean? There's no reason that factory farming can't move in a similar direction, right? If you think about smoking and how prevalent, but even when I was in my 20s, and you would smoke at any bar and any restaurant and in any anywhere you go, people would be smoking publicly, and now that's crazy. You know, that's a massive cultural change in 20 years. So I think a big part of my message to people is always like these kinds of changes do happen. It is possible. We've all seen it in our lifetimes. Um, and that's the work that we have to do, right? Is kind of bring about that kind of step change in the way that this industry operates. But obviously, we are up against massively entrenched, massively wealthy, massively politically powerful corporate interests, which is
Mm.
why we need people power. We're never
And
going to
and
have.
those corporate interests are often behind what looks like the idyllic family
Yeah.
farm. And we run into people, they're followers of the farm to table movement and Michael Pollan and Barbara Kingsolver and all those folks that if you just get your food from the ma and pa, but chances are ma and pa are working for a
Yeah.
big corporation with a name that doesn't have pleasant associations for most people that care about health or the planet, much less animals.
Yep, that's absolutely right. It's like anything else. You go to the grocery store and there's an aisle of snacks, and it looks like there's 1,000 brands of potato. They're all owned by three companies. Do you know what I
Yeah.
mean? And so there's this illusion, right? To your point, this intentional illusion, this facade that's been built to mask for the public, like what's really happening. And so that's what I think a huge amount of our work is just pushing through that, right?
So let's
And
talk about what's really happening. So consumer trends. So what are you seeing that maybe people outside your circle might not know about?
yeah, so I think we see some positive things, and unfortunately, we see some challenging things. What we find is that when given the option to choose higher welfare products and controlling for cost, because we do have to acknowledge that cost is a meaningful barrier to people, particularly right now with the cost of food kind of going through the roof across the board. But when given the option to buy higher welfare products, consumers overwhelmingly want to buy higher welfare products. It is very clear, like when given the choice, people will choose it almost every time. And again, does that translate to everybody buying higher welfare products all the time? No, it doesn't. There are some barriers that stand in the way of that. Cost is one. Deceptive marketing, as you acknowledged, is another, right? Like cage free is a term that means something, right? It means a certain set of welfare standards. Pasture raised is a term that means something, but also, as you know, you go to the grocery store and you'll see like Farmer Brown's all natural farm fresh eggs, and that doesn't mean anything. Anybody can say that, right? So there's a significant amount of consumer confusion,
Mhm.
even amongst people who are well intended and really do want to buy the higher welfare product. They're being lied to and deceived, right, at point of sale by deceptive marketing. So I think there's a positive trend that people want to do what's right for animals. The downside is that it's being made intentionally difficult through cost gouging and through deceptive marketing to make them do that. And I want to talk about the cost gouging because I haven't yet. People may notice that when and again, you and I don't buy eggs at the grocery store, but if people go to the grocery store, they see the egg cartons on the shelves. The carton of cage-free or higher welfare eggs might cost $1 or 2 more, right, than the carton of conventionally raised eggs. It's really important for people to understand that almost all of that markup is corporate profit. It is incrementally more expensive, right, to run a kind of cage free or a higher welfare facility, but it would be measured in like cents on a carton of eggs. You know,
Hmm.
the markup is both price gouging, right? Like companies, it's like a humane tax, like a green tax, right? Where people think, oh, well, this is going to be a premium product. When I say companies think this is a premium product, people will be prepared to pay more for it. So we're going to charge more for it. And this is just maybe my little conspiracy theory, but I also think it's a way that companies are trying to disincentivize people from buying the higher welfare products by making them cost more on purpose. So it's just important that people understand that the real price difference between higher welfare and lower welfare animal products is way less than what you generally see in the grocery store. Um, so anyway, that's one trend that we're seeing. I think another a challenging trend that we're dealing with is what I would think of as the protein craze. I mean, obviously, there's always been a lot of emphasis on protein in the American diet, which is absurd, right? The amount of protein that some people kind of believe that they need to eat, but it has really kind of accelerated over the past sort of 12 to 18 months. Like I think I was in a coffee shop the other day, and they were advertising a protein foam for the coffee. And it was just like, it was like 28 grams of protein in your latte, and it was just like, are you kidding me? It's bananas. Um, so I don't quite know what to do about that, to be honest with you. And my hope is that it's just a fad and it'll pass. But I think it's significantly affecting people's purchasing behavior. It is steering people towards animal products, which they view, I think, incorrectly to be, a kind of the best way to get the absurd amounts of protein that some people are looking to get in their diet.
Mhm, mhm. And one thing that I see in this craze now with the raw milk and all that is that when when the ultimate goal or the highest goal is pretty low. It's almost like if you want to look at the very bottom, it's buying all the food that's the worst for animals, consumers, farmers, everybody. And then you come up a little notch, it's still pretty bad. But if it's advertised, if it's
Right.
talked up as this is the best place to be, then nobody sees these other levels. So I know you guys had a big success back in February. You had a campaign that made everybody pop some corks. What was that?
Yeah, so we and many other organizations in the movement, I don't want to take sole credit for this. We had a long-standing campaign against Ahold Delhaize, which, speaking of corporate consolidation, is a holding company that owns a bunch of major grocery store brands in the United States. So Stop and Shop, Hannaford, Food Lion, these are sort of regional grocery store chains. They're all owned by one company, which is Ahold Delhaize. It's a Dutch company that owns grocery chains around the world. They're one of the five largest retail companies in the United States. They're a significant purchaser and seller of eggs. And they had made a commitment almost 10 years ago to go 100% cage free with their egg supply chain. They'd also made a commitment on gestation crates, and they did not live into those commitments. They backed down from those commitments, took the language off of their website, sort of backed off from the commitments that they'd made. So there was a major coalition campaign, including the Humane League, but also our allies in the movement, groups like Mercy for Animals and Animal Equality, to hold Delhaize accountable to the promise that they'd made. There was a major activist push. There were protests. There were phone calls. There were emails. There were weeks of action. It was almost a year, more than a year, of campaigning against this company. But yeah, to your point, finally in February, Ahold Delhaize finally announced that they would be doing what they said that they would do, which is to fully phase out the use of gestation crates and battery cages in their animal supply chain, which now gives them. And again, I want to our conversation to be clear, right? This does not mean that everything is great for these animals in their supply chain, but what it does mean is that Ahold Delhaize now has by far the strongest farm animal welfare policy of any major retailer, any traditional grocer in the United States. I say traditional grocer because Costco is another company that has a strong animal welfare policy, but they're not categorized as a traditional grocer. But that's important because I mentioned earlier that about half of the U.S. egg industry is now cage free. The half that isn't is primarily supplied to the grocery industry. So really, to move the entire country to cage free, which is our goal over the next 5 years or so, we need to move the grocery industry. And now we have a leading grocery retailer, Ahold Delhaize, that has what we view as a gold standard policy, at least in terms of where we are right now, and the sort of welfare standards that we're trying to hold companies accountable to, which we can now leverage, right, to encourage other major grocery retailers like Kroger, like Albertsons and Safeway, ultimately like Walmart, which is the largest grocer in the country, to make similar progress. We're not there yet, and we will probably have to run some campaigns against some of those companies to get them there. But my experience with trying to move industries like the grocery industry is that there's a competitive dynamic to it, right? Like, no companies generally don't want to be the first to move, which is why we have to run big kind of major campaigns like we did against Ahold. But then once the first company is moved, then nobody wants to be the last to move. They don't want to be left behind, right?
Mm-hmm.
So now we see Ahold as a major kind of domino that's fallen in the kind of strategy of trying to move the U.S. grocery industry to cage free. And now we expect to be able to make significant progress with some of these other companies and hopefully over a more accelerated period of time. So we'll have to see how it goes. But it was important in and of itself because Ahold has, I think, about 6 million hens in their supply chain at any given time. So this is 6 million hens every year whose suffering will be significantly reduced. Like, that's a huge victory in and of itself. But almost more important is the ripple effects it could potentially create for 100 million and more, right, of hens in the entire U.S. grocery egg industry.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Thank you so much. Now, this is the time in the program when I do some shout outs. And for the first time today, I'm going to shout out about another podcast because you listen to podcasts, you like them. So I want to tell you about one called Lantern Voices. And this is a podcast from Lantern Publishing and Media. Now, if you're a vegan or a pre-vegan and you read a lot of books in this area, I'm sure you have some titles from Lantern in your bookcase right this minute. I actually have a book from Lantern, The Love Powered Diet. And now the good people of Lantern have their own podcast where you can hear from wonderful authors who publish with this publishing house that is dedicated to many of the same values in terms of animal rights, veganism, human rights, environmentalism, social justice, and all that good stuff. So you can find Lantern Voices wherever you get podcasts, and I invite you to take a look. And I also invite you, if you have been thinking for, oh my gosh, it's been 13 years that Main Street Vegan Academy has been training and certifying vegan lifestyle coaches and educators. Well, guess what? There is another chance to become a certified vegan lifestyle coach and educator. Our 39th cohort will be happening this fall. It's live on Zoom. We're actually doing something special this year. We're also having an optional weekend in New York City. You can read about that on the website. But just check us out at mainstreetvegan.com. We have fabulous instructors, and they get to know you, and you get to know them, and you get to know your classmates. You're not a number, you really are a person. And you know what else you get? You get me. I mean, for my graduates, I will go to the ends of the earth. I do graduate school recommendations and job recommendations and book blurbs and connections. It's a very, very, very special program. So do have a look, mainstreetvegan.com. And also, if you click there on podcast, that's where you will find the show notes to this episode. You will find out more about the handsome Mr. Shannon, about the Humane League and everything that they are doing, and also about those cookbooks like Betty Goes Vegan that you might have a whole lot of fun with. So, as we wind down, I just wanted to ask, you mentioned several animal organizations
Mm.
in the answer to the last question. And it seems sometimes like, gosh, there's a lot of animal organizations. So, are there too many? Or do we really need everybody because everybody's got their own little niche?
Yeah, it's a great question. It's something we talk a lot in the sort of leadership of the movement is sort of what should the shape of the movement be, to your question. I think it's very important that we are pursuing different strategies to get to our end goal, right? And so I do think we need different organizations and different groups in the movement that are pursuing different strategies. I think we need bigger groups, right, that can make a household name for themselves. I think we need smaller groups that can do act more nimbly and you know what I mean, kind of. So I think it's important that we have a diverse representation of groups in the movement. So I don't want to say that there are too many. What I do think is important is every group, right, really being clear about what their lane is, right, in terms of like what is the unique contribution that we are making to the movement. Because what we don't need, I think, is sort of multiple groups sort of semi competing with each other to kind of fill the same spot. I think that's counterproductive. Uh, we have enough to compete with, right, in terms of the industries that we're up against, and we don't need to spend our time competing with one another.
Absolutely. Well, just as we wind this down, tell me about your life. I mean, how old are your kids? What's it like? You're in Brooklyn, I think.
We
Supposed to
were,
be,
yeah, good
where are you?
memory. We were in Brooklyn.
Yeah.
We live on the Upper West Side in New York City
Okay.
now.
Okay.
Yeah, my daughter is 11.
Oh,
She's a Girl Scout. And she is the most militant vegan I've ever met in my entire life.
oh,
She does all of her school and Girl Scouts projects around different kind of animal protection issues. She's working on a big Girl Scout project right now, making the case that the penguin exhibit at the Central Park Zoo is not equipped to meet these animals' natural environmental needs, which of course it isn't.
yes.
She's doing that to hope to win a silver award, which is one of the most prestigious awards that a Girl Scout can win. And she's the kid who goes to every birthday party that she's ever been invited to, every school event, and says like, "Is the pizza vegan? Are the cupcakes vegan? Why aren't they?" To the point where now all of her friends, they know like, okay, Sadie's coming to the party, so we need to have a vegan pizza and we need to have some vegan cupcakes. And something I take a lot of heart in is that her friends, her peers, they just eat whatever pizza's put on the table in front of them. They don't care if it's vegan or not. It doesn't
Yeah,
even register for them. So it
right.
gives me a lot of hope. Do you know what I mean? To the for the future.
So, Dan, what's it like being a vegan man? There's so many women in our movement, and there are some men, but I don't know if it's one in five or I don't
Yeah.
know. It's not like massive numbers of men. And so, and you've been at this a long time, so there were fewer men when
That's
you
true.
started out than there are now. So what's it like, when you talk to like guy friends from college or the old neighborhood or whatever, just help us get a sense of that experience.
Yeah, it's funny. It's funny you ask about that. So I just a little bit. So I grew up in Boston. I grew up in a sort of, I don't know, working class, lower middle class town. So a lot of the people that I grew up with, cousins of mine, do you know what I mean? Are not necessarily, we'll put it this way, like the kind of what you would think of as the traditional audience. Do you know what I mean? For maybe a podcast like this one, do you know what I mean? Or the work that we do at the Humane League. And so, I'd be lying if I said there wasn't a little kind of friendly ribbing about things every once in a while. But I, let me put it this way. This is a bit of a tangent, but I think we have a real crisis with men and masculinity in this country and around the world. If you talk about toxic masculinity, extremely unproductive social behavior, like there's a problem with men, right? And so one of the things I think a lot about is sort of like what does a man's positive contribution to the world look like? Like what can it look like to be a man and to be a force for good in the world? Because we have so many examples of men not doing that. Um, and one of the things that I think about is, things that we think about as being maybe like traditionally masculine values, right? Or things like being brave, right? And I think it's a brave thing to do to stand by your values and take an unpopular or maybe, sort of minority opinion on. Like most people aren't vegan and some of us who are men choose to be. And I think that's a very masculine thing to do, right? Is sort of like leaning, like making a courageous decision. One of the things that's sort of drilled into you as a boy or as a man is like you're supposed to protect others, you're supposed to, sort of like be a protector. And I think about veganism and my work at the Humane League as a way of kind of bringing that into the world as a sort of positive way of manifesting that, right? It's sort of like I'm trying to protect others. So I don't know. I often think about um, my role as a vegan man as being part of like, to the extent that anybody's paying attention to what I'm doing or sort of thinking of me as a role model or whatever, it's just like trying to present a different way, of thinking about some of these ideas of masculinity and sort of what it can look like to use them as a force for good in the world as opposed to using masculinity as a force for not so good, which we have plenty of examples
Mm-hmm.
of.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. That's really cool. And nice to know you're on the Upper West Side, so you're not so far from me. Maybe we can get a peace food cafe and
There
eat some
regularly.
greenery. Well, thank you. Thank you so much for this. And everybody, thank you for being part of this hour with us. You can get to know Dan better, as I said, if you look for the show notes at mainstreetvegan.com. But let me give you a couple of URLs just to get you started. The website for the Humane League is thehumaneleague.org. And you can also find them on Instagram, The Humane League. And we'll put all that stuff, as I said, in the show notes. And the cookbook, remember, Betty Goes Vegan. And you know what? We are out there doing our best, all in our lanes, trying to get the job done and create a kinder, gentler, saner world. So thank you, Mr. Dan Shannon. And thank you, everybody, for listening. Let us get ourselves out there and make Main Street vegan.